Please be warned, this episode contains graphic descriptions of violence and atrocities against people, which may be alarming to some listeners.
On 1st of March 1943, on a morning roll call, a block leader declared that children under 17 should assemble because they would go to school, presumably to attend a course for nurses. And after that they would regain their freedom. It all happened in the presence of an SS man who counted all the boys. Because my brother was 13 years old, he believed in the promise of dismissal and stepped out of the line, although I urged him not to do so. I didn't, even though I wasn't 17 years old. On the same day, 80 boys were taken from Birkenau to the main camp Auschwitz, and there, my brother got a deadly injection together with the other boys in his group.
Hello and welcome back to the Auschwitz Liberation Podcast. We are now on episode 9, our final episode of this podcast series. I hope you found it interesting and informative what we've been talking about. And if you do have any questions, I might be able to wrangle Kate and Chris for us to do a Q&A session, maybe in a week or two's time once people have had a chance to catch up with this podcast series. But before we start talking about these post-war trials, the testimony you just heard was Josef Koch. His name in the camp was Sasin, his surname. He received the camp number 82781. He was a young Polish boy from Zamość. He was one of those that was deported with his family members into Auschwitz and miraculously survived, because many young Polish boys didn't survive from Zamość. Anyway, what we're going to be talking about today, we're going to talk about post-war trials, we're going to talk about justice. Did these people get the justice that we think they deserve? It's a bit of a hot topic and an interesting thing now, especially what's happening with the war in Ukraine, talking about post-war trials and how they panned out and things like that. So we'll start with Höss's trial. So Kate, can you tell us a little bit about who Höss was? Because some of our listeners might not know who he was. And, let's talk about this trial. What happened? Where did it happen? And what were the results of it?
Yes, so Rudolf Höss, probably most famously known as the commandant of Auschwitz. However, he had sort of a long and protracted career, really. In preparation for this, I'm just going to throw this in here, that I actually read his memoirs that he wrote whilst he was awaiting his sentence to be delivered. And it's made for really, really interesting reading. Got to take into account all of this stuff I'm about to say, and the fact he was trying to exonerate himself, of course. So he served in the First World War. He said he wanted to be in the army and was talked into joining the SS. And in November 1939, he became the deputy commandant of the concentration camp at Sachsenhausen on the outskirts of Berlin. It's there he kind of earned his stripes, I guess. In May 1940, the Auschwitz I camp was set up. I know a lot of people may have looked at sort of popular culture and zone of interest, probably the thing that most people think about with Höss now. And we know about him living, so close to the camp, etc. And that his family didn't want to leave when he was assigned to the concentration camps inspectorate at the SS main economic and administrative building in Oranienburg. It's literally a stone's throw from Sachsenhausen. In May of 1944, on the orders of Himmler, he was returned to Auschwitz. And actually, the action that he was responsible for was even named after him, Action Höss. And this was the extermination of 430,000 Hungarian Jews. He even had a new railway line built, so it came right into the camp and the railway siding that people can see today. He was in charge of all of that. It was named after him. He also took part in the evacuation of the prisoner population and what we today call the death marches, and we have recounted those over the last few days. So Höss was responsible for getting the prisoners out of the camp, pretending none of it had happened. After the fall of the German Reich, the Third Reich, he and his family hid in the British zone. So, of course, both Germany and Berlin were divided up amongst the victorious powers. He disappeared off to be a farmer, pretended he'd been in the Navy. But the War Crimes Division of the 21st Army were in possession of a significant amount of material to prove who he was and to effect his arrest. Apparently, he was brutally interrogated by the British. In fact, I know that Vera Atkins, who is one of the women I write about, actually interrogated him. And he was eventually taken to Nuremberg, where he appeared as a witness in 3 trials. So first off, the main Nuremberg trial, and then the trial of the SS Main Economic and Administrative Office, and then the IG Farben trial. On the 25th of May 1946, Rudolf Höss was handed over to Polish officers and extradited to Poland. And there, from the 25th of May to the 30th of July, he was incarcerated in Mokotów prison in Warsaw, and then he was transported to Montelupich prison in Krakow. And this marked the beginning of his longest period of detention. It lasted until the 21st of February 1947. Then he was put on trial, headed by the eminent lawyer Jan Sen. The Hearst trial was, all on its own, and it took place in Warsaw. He was again taken back after he had sentence given to Mokotów prison, where he stayed for a few weeks and spent his last days in the prison at Wadowice. And he wrote those memoirs that I've just attested to during that time as well. His trial was held in one of the largest halls of the Polish Teachers Union building. In fact, Alina, I think you pointed this building out to me when we were in Warsaw, because it was also a big part of the uprising, wasn't it?
It was. You remembered.
I do remember these things. And it was chosen not only because it was so big, it could accommodate 500 people, but because of that link that we've just pointed out there. It was fitted with equipment which allowed for the simultaneous translation of proceedings into 4 languages, those of the victors: French, English, and Russian, and of course German. Entrance cards allowing for participation in one court sitting were distributed amongst members of the public. There were so many people who wanted to go to Höss's trial that they wouldn't all fit in even this enormous hall. 50 foreign delegates, 30 government representatives, and 20 witnesses, which isn't a lot when you consider what this man, who nearly swore, was being accused of. He was very composed at his trial. He testified calmly. At times, he even added comments to the testimonies of the witnesses, correcting them or adding detail, which is freakish in itself, isn't it? And he very often, and he does this in his memoirs as well, he speaks of the obligation to follow orders. He also stressed that he was unaware of any violations and only had suspicions with regards to things like the prisoners' food rations being stolen, or that the functionary prisoners had behaved sadistically and abused their power. He said he didn't really know about this. He also said, personally, I have not stolen anything, nor have I abused or killed prisoners. Everything I have done had been commanded by my superiors, by whom he means Himmler. I have done nothing, or I have not done anything out of ill will. That said, I do not intend to evade responsibility.
Can I add a comment here?
I was going to add one myself, but go on.
I mean, he's not technically wrong, because he didn't really beat prisoners. He just let other people do it. So he's right. He never did beat prisoners.
No, you're right. I mean, his testimony, and I said you've got to read that with such caution, but he does say it was always other people. And he was just a mentioned zone of interest in one of the other episodes. And I know it's not a documentary. I'm not pretending it is. But you do get the impression he's very detached from all of this. It's happening by other people to other people. He seems incredibly detached from all of it. So no, I guess he's not wrong. But then again, I was following orders.
There's a testimony from one of the former prisoners who was brought back. Actually, funnily enough, we had his testimony at the beginning of the podcast series, Zbigniew Turecki. He actually comes back and he meets Höss face to face, because obviously he was deported, he was released and then brought back, and, that whole palaver. And he says that he meets Höss face to face because, it was a unique situation that he was brought back to the camp. I just want to read from his testimony here really, really briefly. So he said, says, "On my return to Auschwitz, the SS took us straight to the political command. I was called out of the transport and taken to Commandant Huss's office. I waited for a while outside, then they let me in. I was still in civilian clothes, but I remembered where I was and stood to attention, and reported myself as number 214, having been released by mistake. I waited in apprehension, looking him straight in the eye, wondering what would happen next. And you never knew what these Nazi murderers would get into their heads, especially considering that 3 people had escaped from the transport. Commandant Huss made no mention of this, but after my report, he started to laugh, and so psychologically I knew there was no danger. He asked me first of all if I had a good holiday. I answered, yes, naturally. I mentioned that I'd seen my mother, but I did not want to go into details. I waited for him to speak. He started by making excuses for my mistaken release, and he said he was not responsible for my unavoidable return. He asked me if I had any particular wish, which is what I had been waiting for. So I asked him politely if I could have my original number. Hess said, of course, I would have my number back again. He made some notes on a paper he had on the table in front of him, and it was all over. He ordered an SS to go with me individually into the camp, where I was to be taken to the clothing store and fitted out with a prison uniform with my original number. Obviously, not all interactions were as positive as this with Huss.
Yeah, it's weird, isn't it? This whole double life that these people led. I'm sure we've talked about it, but witnessing what you witness, overseeing things, and then going home and giving your kids a cuddle and a bath. Yeah, I mean, this is a whole different thing, isn't it? But yeah, he says time and time and time again, I was following orders, I was following. This is where it all comes from. We haven't got time to get into all of that. Let's get down to what he was charged with. So he was charged with membership in a criminal organisation, the SS, which wasn't criminal in Germany, if we're going to play devil's advocate like this, and consequently with planning, organising and perpetrating crimes against humanity, war crimes and crimes against peace. As camp commandant, he was also charged with the physical and moral ill treatment of prisoners and with the participating in the plunder of victims' property. I don't know how true it is, but there's the opening scene in Zone of Interest. His wife and their friends are sitting around going through clothing, a big pile of clothing being dumped in the house. I've no idea how true that is, but I get the feeling it probably did happen. Anyway, he also had an indictment included in the accusation that he personally abused prisoners and shot at them. Whether or not there's any testimony that can back that up.
Prisoners were terrified. I mean, we've got a testimony that is going to come out after this, after we've, Kate and I stopped talking. We've got a great testimony that shows you how terrified prisoners truly were. So, maybe he did shoot at prisoners. We don't 100% know. But,
No, I mean, that's something that you think about with Plaszow, really, isn't it? And
oh God, yeah.
Gerd, just randomly shooting at people from his balcony, or, they went hunting, but hunting for humans. What I was going to say about all of this testimony and the things that he says, we've had a lot of talk about denial over the last few days, about Holocaust denial. If the perpetrators admit they did it, who are these deniers to say that, it's just ridiculous, isn't it? How you can even begin to consider denying that this happened. I go off on a tangent, but I find it so weird.
Do you know what? I can see what they would say, that he was forced under duress or some absolute rubbish. Because when you were saying that, I was thinking, how could I flip this around?
But even if he was under duress, he still did it.
Well, yeah.
It doesn't matter if he was under duress or not. The Holocaust happened, and it happened at his hands. God, it was called Operation Hearse, Action Hearse. He was so great, they named the murder of nearly 500,000 people after him.
He had to learn how to burn people, for God's sakes. That in itself is, does that not give you an idea of what happened to all the corpses of people, really, at the end of the day? When they're like, where are all the bodies? They were cremated, people. That is a possibility. Oh, yeah, that was, yeah.
They were dug up and cremated as well. Anyway, what happened to him? Did he get his comeuppance? Now, he was sentenced to death, and at the request of former prisoners, his execution was carried out in the grounds of the camp. It's actually, if anyone's been to Auschwitz I, well, it's now the entrance to the remains of the gas chambers. He was sentenced to be executed, and the former prisoners wanted him executed in the grounds of the former camp. So basically, he has gallows set up outside the gas chambers in view of his house, which I know Alina's been into. So in view of the house and in view of the gas chambers, and his last view would have been of those barracks, he is hanged In their petition, the inmates wrote, "This man who committed murders and played a prominent part in causing the deaths of millions of people should die in the same place as his victims." So the gallows were erected. They didn't want to use the gallows still standing next to Block 11, the punishment block on which prisoners were hanged. Hearst had his very own gallows. At his last wish...
He didn't deserve it.
No, well, maybe, he deserved a lot worse than being hanged.
No, but I mean, as in, by Block 11, he did not deserve to die where innocent people were murdered. He deserved his own. He deserves his own hanging noose.
No, absolutely. I completely agree with you. And it's still there, isn't it? Or a replica of it is there. So apparently he wanted a cup of coffee and a Catholic priest present at his execution. His body was burned in an undisclosed location, and like the millions of people, or hundreds of thousands of people, who were murdered on his command, his ashes were thrown into a nearby river. One of the prisoners who testified during the trial quoted the following statement that was made by Hearst. He said, "Our system is so horrifying that no one in the world will ever believe it was possible. For even if some Jew had escaped from Auschwitz and recounted what he had seen, he would have been taken for a fantasizing liar."
That's true. They were people that escaped and told the truth. So think about what the Americans, when they got that information, nah, that's not possible. Don't be ridiculous. And then what came out? Sorry.
Yeah. And it continues, doesn't it? It continues today. It's something that I'm knee-deep in at the moment, is this wonderful book by Deborah Lipstadt talking about Holocaust denial and how people were told they were not telling the truth. It was all swimming pools and days out, apparently.
Oh, God, I love that. Do you know what? We've got to do another podcast on Holocaust denial because it's so funny. It's disgusting how funny it is. So, but so not forgetting, we got a testimony of Henrik Mandelbaum, actually. We've heard a lot from him this podcast. So have a listen of that.
Did the witness distinguish between the camp commandant and the commandant of the inner camp, the so-called Lagerführer?
I once saw the commandant, horse. Of course, riding on a horse. Prisoners who saw him from distance said, "The commandant is riding," and everything disappeared like camphor. Everyone hid in a hole like mice. That's when I met the chief commandant. That is Hoss.
Was it far from the witness?
Not far, because I was almost on the square.
When was the more or less in relation to the witness' arrival at the camp?
In 2 or 3 months after his arrival.
That means that it could have been in September 1944?
In July or August 1944.
Well, that was really interesting about Hearst. But Hearst's trial wasn't the only one that was high profile and going on at this time. And that is the first Auschwitz trial. Tell us about that, Chris.
Yeah, that kind of kicked off after Hearst's execution, and it took place, ironically, at the Montelupik prison in Krakow, which used to be the Gestapo's main prison, where 40 former staff members of Auschwitz were tried over a period of a year or two. And out of the 40, 23 were sentenced to death and 17 to imprisonment. And one, Hans Munch, is actually acquitted. But you've got quite a mix of people going from commandants down to guards with Blockführers and the Gestapo. And there are some pretty nasty characters involved in this, isn't there?
Oh, yes. Let's go through some of these people that were tried, because some of them, I think some of them got a light. I mean, I'm going to be talking about the Frankfurt trials where people got off super light. But this one, I think, I'd say probably the largest or the heaviest perpetrators got their comeuppance, but some of these people should have gotten more.
Yeah. I mean, people like Grabner, who we've spoken about before, got what he deserved. I mean, prior to the war, he'd been a policeman in Austria, joined the SS, then into the Gestapo, and he was in charge of Block 11. Lots of torture, lots of just random murder, just because you could. I mean, the shootings outside Block 11 are just horrendous. You just have to look at them the wrong way, and they're just up against the wall and shot. And although briefly tried by the Nazis.
Well, yeah, this is something that you and I talk about quite a lot, though, isn't it?
Yeah. In our free time when we're not doing this, we talk about this. But yeah, he was tried by the Nazis for corruption and theft,
but never saw a day in prison. But yeah, he definitely got what he deserved. I mean, there was examples of him murdering just children just for giggles. There was the shooting of the commissars, which was standard Wehrmacht practice as well. But there were and just out and out murder all over the place. So definitely got what he deserved.
Well, in this trial, I mean, there were 3 commandants of Auschwitz, and obviously, the first one has his own trial. The second one is Arthur Lieber Henschel, who, if anybody ever hears me talking about him, I call him the biggest idiot, because he was so shit at his job at Auschwitz. Sorry to say, I mean, I know it's not funny, but he was so shit at his job at Auschwitz that they sent him to Majdanek 2 months before the liberation, and he screwed that up too. So completely useless. But tell us a little bit about Arthur Lieber Henschel, because he's the highest person tried in this trial.
Yeah. I mean, he's as I was saying off recording, we've got the same birthday date. Not the year, obviously.
Creepy.
Yes, but he succeeds Horst and makes quote unquote improvements and gets rid of like the standing cells and halting the selections to the gas chambers among the regular prisoners. But obviously knows what he's doing.
He can I add one more thing here? He releases one of my favourite human beings, actually, Otto Kuzel, one of the capo. We'll talk about, if you come onto our Patreon, I'll make sure to do a whole episode on functionary prisoners because they are my biggest fascination. But that's the one thing good for me that he does is that not that killing people is not good, but you know what I mean. But the point of this is that he releases Otto Kuzel, who's been locked up after trying to escape. So that's a good thing that he does do.
Yeah, and doesn't he? He also sort of cuts back on the SS being randomly brutal on people, but
doesn't work though.
Oh no,
he does
God
try.
No. Yeah, but even still, yes, you're not allowed to just randomly beat them to death, but you're still running a death camp and concentration camp.
Which is why he was shit at his job. Because he wasn't doing what he was expected of him. So that's why they sent him off to Majdanek, far, far away. And I don't mean, and people taking this out of context from me, saying that, he wasn't doing his job because he shouldn't have been murdering people. Well, that's what he was supposed to be doing. That's why he was shit at his job. Sorry.
But we also have some other high-ranking members of concentration camp staff as well, including Schutzhaftlagerführer Hans Almer. He would have been in charge of sort of Canada and the appropriated goods, to give it sort of his German name, and he was at the camp between 1942 and 43, and was involved in torture, beatings, and executions. And on the 19th of March in 1942, he had 144 women were shot at the execution wall in the courtyard between Block 11 on his orders. He was also done for corruption as well. But yeah, so another nasty.
Are we surprised?
No, not at all. It's fairly rife at this point. And then, of course, we have Marie Mandel, the the commandant of the female camp at Birkenau. And again, she's pretty messed up. She's involved in all kinds of horrible, horrible torture. And then she seems to undergo some kind of nervous breakdown once she's been arrested. And she was described in 1947 in the press as Marie Mandel behaves differently. She does her best to be in control of herself, but her efforts are futile. The woman who condemned female prisoners to death with a single gesture now cannot control her accelerated breathing, unnatural blush, and nervous twitching of her entire face. And she runs into a former prisoner and begs for forgiveness. It's all a bit strange, but yeah, she was another description of her in 1942 was that one of the prisoners went into the female guards barracks where she was, and they could hear someone playing the piano really beautifully, and when they walked around the corner, it was Marie Mandel, and she'd been the one that had just been brutally murdering people a few days previously. She's a very complicated person.
She's a horrible piece of shit.
Yeah, that too.
Sorry. That's the frankest way that I could more or less say Marie Mandel. But I think that story of her when she meets with that Polish prisoner, they run into each other in the bathing like bathhouse part of the prison, and this female prisoner had been tortured under her, and now she's back in prison, and they meet, and it's just such a strange moment where you have like a prisoner versus their torturer in this place, and she forgives her. I mean, I don't know if I could.
Yeah. I don't think a lot of people could. But it's not all sort of the mass execution stuff. You also have people like Ludwig Plager, who...
Oh, yes. Ludwig Plager.
I mean, he is involved in, torture, mass execution and things. But at the same time, it's the casual brutality such as he's in charge. He comes up with quote unquote sports, which you'd think would be, oh yeah, get the prisoner to do some jogging, yeah, for 4 hours, or at a moment's notice, sort of right, crawl on your bellies across the gravel, or singing, and if you didn't like your singing, you'd be in trouble in a really bad way. And it's just casual brutality, and that he was in charge of thinking these up and was just happy to do it, and he'd just sit there with his pipe watching them.
He was there from the beginning. He was one of the first SS men that came to the camp, and throughout all the testimonies of the early days, what I studied for ages, you just see plaga, 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 plaga. He forced us to do sports. He forced us to squat and crawl because it exhausted the prisoners. This is the idea behind this sport, is to exhaust the prisoners so that they don't think about escaping. And the funny thing is when the first escape happens, Tadeusz escapes on the 7th of July of 1940, he forces the prisoners to stand for about a 20-hour roll call. And that was the longest roll call in Auschwitz history, and one of the most horrific moments. And if you read these testimonies of all of these people who'd arrived, even a transport who had arrived on this day, that's the first shock of their system they have, is standing on this roll call for 20 hours.
So in the post-war period, there's still 8,200 members of the Auschwitz staff who don't get tried or don't face any justice. But 10 years later, roughly 10 years later, we get another trial, don't we?
We do, because this is the thing. Just before I start on this trial, I just wanted to add another thing overall, just to sum all of this in together, is that Auschwitz, the trials that were happening at the same time as Auschwitz trial, you also have the Dachau, the Belsen, Neuengamme trials. You have so many trials going on at the same time. And there were also loads of Auschwitz personnel being tried in some of these other trials. Like, for example, Otto Moll, who was the head of the crematoria, for example, he was tried in the Dachau trials and he was sentenced to death. So if they weren't necessarily tried in those trials, they were tried in other trials. But then there would also, like Chris said, that's not the end of it, because there are 3 more trials that happen between 1963 and 65. And before that, after all of this, this hype had died down over these trials, the Allies they lost their enthusiasm for pursuing German criminals. It wasn't of interest, really. And the other issue here was that the GDR was really eager to present itself as anti-fascist. But the problem here is that many of these perpetrators, they'd found safe haven in Germany, and they were denazified, especially in the Federal Republic of Germany. And that part of Germany was even shallower. People just hiding left, right, and center. And I'll tell you about one of these guys who was hiding in plain sight, and the story behind it is just crazy. So even in German offices, there was a high percentage of former members of the NSDAP, even the SS. I mean, for God's sakes, people that perpetrated the Warsaw Uprising never faced criminal charges. Anyway, moving on. As I said, there are 3 trials that are taking place in Frankfurt between 63 and 68. And this was due to the determination of people like Fritz Bauer. There's now a Fritz Bauer Institute. It's a very great website that you can go to and browse through some of the testimonies and the trials and things like that. But they've got a lot in their archives that hasn't been really touched and looked at. So it's something that I would love to be able to go and do, and just sit in their archives and gaze through some of these. So in 1958, there was an inquiry that was launched by the Central Office of the State Justice Administration for the investigation of Nazi National Socialist crimes. Bit of a mouthful. And the German Supreme Court. So there was a huge amount of evidence, and because of this, it took 5 years for them to prepare even the first trial. So in this time period, there's over 800 people that are investigated, but this is the worst thing, only 22 are officially brought to trial. Now, one person who was supposed to stand trial is Karl Klauberg. And I can't remember if we talked about him in the main episode or in our Patreon, but Karl Klauberg was a doctor who participated in experiments of sterilization, especially women. He took predominantly Jewish women and he would inject them with various different types of liquid into their fallopian tubes. These women ended up getting sepsis and then dying because of the various different chemicals that were being injected into their body. Anyway, he's supposed to stand trial. He doesn't. And he basically dies before he gets there. He did stand trial in under the Soviet regime, and he got like 15 years and didn't nothing really came of it. He served some of it, came back and opened back his practice and continued practicing as a doctor, which is disgusting in itself that a man who literally murdered women is allowed to practice. So he never got to see justice, or what most of us would believe to be justice. Anyway, the largest one was the first one, and that was held in the years 1963 to 1965. Robert Mulca was the highest ranking person that was tried. Now, some of you may ask, who is Robert Mulca? Really interesting story, actually. He stands actually in the second trial rather than the first one. He does not feel guilty for what he did. He was Husse's deputy. And the question is, well, actually, the answer to this is very simple. How did they find him? He was still under his original name. Never changed it, was still in Germany. And how they found him was his son was competing in the Olympics and got a bronze medal. And one of the prosecutors who was searching for Robert Mulca saw the surname on the TV and said, that name looks kind of familiar. And then, of course, they found Robert Mulca and have taken him to court. From the first hearings, he claimed that he did not know the area of the camp or even heard of any gas chambers. But the evidence was so extensive because he was also responsible for the supply of Zyklon B to Auschwitz. He took an active part in the killing of prisoners, and some actually personally with his own hands, and sometimes in cooperation with former functionary prisoners or other SS men. He was sentenced to 14 years. I'll talk about these sentences in a minute because this is ridiculous. He's sentenced to 14 years in prison. He's released after 3 years, and he dies while he's free. So the other very interesting thing is that he never said sorry. He never apologized, and he never took accountability. He never said, I regret it and I am sorry. Not one person utters this sentence while they're being tried in the Frankfurt trials. Coming back to this, the other person that was being tried is Wilhelm Burger. He worked alongside Grabner, so I think some of you may be able to guess exactly what kind of human being this was. During his school years, he became an active member of the Hitler Youth. He joined the NSDAP, then the SA. He became then a police officer, part of the political police in Germany. He then became criminal secretary, even though he was tried for assault that he'd committed while he was in office. That's kind of swept under the rug. He ended up being posted to Poland during the Second World War, and then in 1940 he was charged with aiding and coercing an abortion. So he was sentenced to prison. Then he was downgraded from Hauptsturmführer to Obersturmführer. He was suspended from the police service and sent to the Eastern Front. He got wounded. Then he got sent, you guessed it, to Auschwitz in December of 1942. This is where he took over the department for the escape and theft and manhunt within the political department. And he worked under Grabner. The prisoners gave him the nickname Beast of Auschwitz. He'd shot people randomly during interrogations, he tortured people, and he also included a new type of torture method. So basically, all in all, a disgusting human being. So when the liberation is advancing, and it's actually on the eve of liberation, he participated in transporting secret files to Buchenwald. He then moved to the political department at Mittelbau-Dora, and after the war he went into hiding with his parents, but the military police arrested him in 1945. Now, wouldn't you like to think that he should have been tried in the first Auschwitz trials? Well, you're wrong, because he does admit to everything he did in Auschwitz. He described exactly what he did and basically said, oh, it was just normal police work. I was just a policeman. I did what I had to do. When he was supposed to be extradited to Poland, he fled. And he managed to get to Baden-Württemberg. He lived there up until 1949, when he was being investigated for the assault from 1936. Then he went through the denazification process. As Chris described it to me off camera or off recording, basically he just had to say yes, 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 and yes. Didn't he, Chris?
Right, yeah. I mean, the problem with Germany was faced with so many people who'd been members of the Nazi party in one part or another, and they were trying to rebuild, because you get people who'd been like judges, people who'd served the Reich judiciary, like, well, we need judges, so we'll just sign here. You're not going to do this again, are you? Nope, everything you did was wrong. Yes, clear.
Exactly. But Borger isn't so lucky. He doesn't managed to get away again, because in 1958 a former prisoner denounces him and he's imprisoned and finally charged in the 1963 trials, so in the first Frankfurt Auschwitz trial. And he denied any involvement in the crimes, he insulted spectators, he mocked witnesses, and he showed the Hitler salute in the courtroom. So I don't think that denazification process really worked with him. I don't know, what do you think, Chris?
No, there are quite a few people who underwent the process who, I mean, from my end, if you've ever watched an interview with Grand Admiral Dönitz, he's very, very unrepentant in his beliefs. And there are quite a few people who what was the other guy? Meyer Reimer, who was the guy who instrumental in stopping the Valkyrie von Stauffenberg plot. Again, very unrepentant. Went through so it's very difficult to shake the indoctrination.
He's one of the few that get sentenced to life imprisonment and 5 years for extra in prison for at least 5 counts of murders, and at least 109 counts of joint murder and joint aiding and abetting of joint murder. He then dies in custody in April of 1977. So he serves less than 10 years, or just over 10 years.
And I remember when we talked about the Gestapo, I talked about the Bolger chair, and anyone who can come up with that kind of instrument and what they did, again, was probably got off rather leniently in comparison to the others.
Yeah, well, that's the torture method, actually, that I mentioned earlier. So, Chris, do you know what? Explain it for our listeners just one more time, because it's much easier because you talked about it before.
Yeah, it was a metal bar suspended from the ceiling, and you'd be manacled to it by your hands and ankles, and then they would swing you, and as it came past a guard, they'd hit you with a metal rod or metal pipe, and Bolger would ask you questions, starting off relatively calmly, but then eventually turning into just screaming at you, and often the prisoners were just beaten to death, hanging from this metal sort of swing, if I remember correctly, into sort of blooded pulps that were dragged out of the block. It's just horrendous.
Absolutely disgusting. I hope he's rotting in hell. But just to finish this off, because we've already taken up too much of your time at this point, there were other also people that were charged, and if you go head to our Patreon account, we'll talk a little bit more about some of the people. There were all in all 360 witnesses, including 211 former Auschwitz prisoners, most of them who came from Poland. And a really important moment that took part in this trial was when they did an on-site inspection of Auschwitz that they conducted in December of 1964. So it was, quite a powerful and really detailed trial. Now, the problem being is that 6 people received life imprisonment, and that was Boga, Kaduk, Baretsky, Bednarek, Hoffman, and Kleur. 3 were acquitted. The rest received sentences from between 7 to a dozen or so years in prison. And then, of course, 2 of them died before even being able to be taken to trial. So, in a way, did these people truly and really get their comeuppance, and did they receive what they should have? And a lot of people have criticised these sentences are just too lenient. I don't know. What do you think, Chris?
I think it's difficult. There are obviously, I don't necessarily believe in executions in the current age. However, as that was the punishment at the time, I think that there are a few people here who had done enough to warrant an execution in comparison to some of the contemporaries who were executed. I think, but especially even with the second Auschwitz trial, Bolger should have, by rights, compared to the others who were, I mean, Grabner was executed. Bolger should have been up there too, to be fair, and there should be stricter punishments. Some people have literally got away with murder.
Just to round up on this, we've only touched on 3 trials. Well, I've touched on a little bit more because there were 3 trials within mine. So, but we've only touched on a handful of trials. Now, these were not the only Auschwitz trials or people, like I've mentioned, because obviously people were being tried in Dachau and whatnot, but also people were being tried in things like the IG Farben trials. And there were so many of these, including Polish trials that were happening in Poland that were going against people that, for example, a former capo that I work on quite a lot. But also there are instances where prisoners are, and these are all individual trials, by the way, prisoners are taken to court, and then, or even just before court, it's decided that there is enough there isn't enough evidence against them, or a lot of people have turned out for them and given testimonies and sworn affidavits to say this person didn't actually commit these crimes, or this person did it because they were forced to. Because there are, I mean, we say this to the SS and I was forced to do it, but there are instances where people had no choice. It was literally do it or you will die yourself. And in that, do you punish those people for that? I don't know.
I mean, it's a tough decision. I mean, there's a few examples of that where people have said, I had to kill the man who was at Munch, the guy who was acquitted, who said, I may have murdered some people, but I also, but in doing so, I saved a lot more. I mean, if you've killed someone, you've killed someone, but by killing a couple of people, you've saved. Instead of killing 3 people, you've saved 30. Is that a good thing?
Yeah. Well, the thing is this is where the whole black and white situation comes into, and it's something that I'd love to be able to write about eventually, is looking at the capos, but no historian wants to touch this subject because it is that controversial. And I know some very high-ranking concentration camp historians that are just like, no, I would never touch it. So maybe I might be stupid enough to be able to do that because it is such a black and white situation, because there are so many concentration camp capo that do that. And I have so many examples of these kinds of situations where, you know, you beat a prisoner because if you didn't, an SS officer or an SS guard would have shot them on the spot. What is better, being able to save their life by beating them or allowing them to be shot dead? I mean, it is, and we cannot, under no circumstances, put modern day values or our normal day-to-day values on what was happening in the concentration camp system. No way.
It wasn't even every day for the 1940s. The concentration camps are their own bubbles of immorality.
So this is the end of our second season for our podcast Moments in Time World War II History Edition. Be sure to tune in. Our next season will be up in April. But in the meantime, while we're having this 2-month gap, we will be putting stuff up on Patreon. We have discussed possibly maybe throwing an episode or 2 on this platform, so the free platform, but we will have much more content, and you'll be able to help us decide in future projects, in what intro music to be using, and any other suggestions you may have that you'll see on our Patreon, where we'll be able to talk to our listeners more and more. So thank you so much for listening. We really appreciate everything you've done, all of your support, and all of those 5-star reviews that you've been sending up on our listening platforms. So thank you so much from myself, Chris, and Kate, Zane, who is not here, and obviously our fabulous graphic artist, Steve. I also want to thank the Centre of Digital History at the Adama Mickiewicz University, who helped us record a lot of our testimonies. So we are very grateful for your help and for your students who have participated in this podcast. But that is it from us. So thank you so much, and we will see you for our next season.